That port like a gate, cold hands on the log file stack. Unknown Mac on the wire trying to slip through black. Malicious connection, I see you ping in the dead of night. Your handshake came in crooked, your timing don't feel right. Hash that file flag, that trace, pull the train from the noise. All you see in the subnet, 100 down with poise. Map it out. Welcome to the webinar. My name's Leon Poggioli, and it is great to have you here for the second in my series of OT or CPS cybersecurity discussions. This one's about threat detection for cyber physical systems. So the agenda, I'll tell you a little bit about NetSeg, do a quick recap on the first video because asset integrity and asset discovery is really a fundamental element of a good OT cybersecurity program. I'll talk about OT SecOps and where it fits into the OT cybersecurity journey methodology that I've developed. I'll show you an example IR playbook for an OT environment, an OT incident. I'll talk a little bit about threat hunting, and then I'll show you some use cases in a live system. Now, there are lots of tools that can do these kinds of use cases. The tool I'm going to be using is Clarity because it's the product I'm most familiar with, and I used to work for Clarity. But there are lots of tools that work, can give you these kinds of use cases, and Clarity is not the only tool I work with when I'm helping my clients. So NetSeg was founded this year by me, Leon Poggioli. I used to be Australia-New Zealand Regional Vice President, Industrial for Clarity. And the reason I founded the company was I had a vision of solving the people and process challenges in these cybersecurity programs. And, when you work for a technology provider, the technology does a really good job of doing what it's supposed to do, but you need the people and process around it, especially when you're solving OT cybersecurity problems, to really get the full value out of that technology. And I started the business because I just felt like the Australian market, which is where I work, needed more of that kind of capability. So if you're trying to solve the OT cybersecurity challenge in your organization and you need some help, get in touch with me. My email's leon@netseg.io. Happy to have a quick discussion with you about what you need to do and how we can help you. And then maybe we can talk about what that arrangement might look like longer term. So some reminders from the first video around asset integrity. And the reason I've got this up here, this is actually a power station in Denmark that's also a ski slope or a hiking trail in the summer. And one of the interesting things that happened a couple of years ago, it's all public knowledge, you can look it up, was the Danish power grid suffered a targeted cyber attack where I believe it was 6 power stations were attacked and taken offline. Because the attackers exploited a vulnerability in some Zixel firewalls. Now, the firewall vendor or the vulnerability doesn't matter in this case. What was interesting is one of the organizations that was attacked didn't even realize they had this particular model of Zixel firewall in their environment because it was installed by a private contractor that installed their CCTV cameras, and it was used to protect those cameras. But the CCTV cameras were facing the internet, they were accessible by these attackers, and they used them to then laterally move inside the organization. So all the threat intelligence in the world doesn't help you, or all the vulnerability and exposure information in the world doesn't help you if you don't know what's actually in your environment and what can get attacked. And I'm going to talk a little bit about the importance of combining threat intelligence with business context so you know what's actually happening in your environment and where you need to focus. So you can't protect what you can't see. It's really important to take these OT counterparts on the journey because you need their help all the way through. And you're going to see this in the playbook I'm going to show you later on. There is a mega trend driving that demand for cybersecurity around more automation, more exposure to the internet, and more technology going into these environments, as well as connectivity. OT incident response is very different from IT incident response. Typically in an IT incident, the first thing you do is try and contain that malware as quick as you can. If someone's machine goes offline for 2 hours, it's not a big deal. In the OT world, how you respond to an incident could actually make the problem worse than the attackers being in there. And, if you affect a safety instrumentation system, for example, and it causes a safety incident in the organization, well, that's a really bad thing to do. And we want to be able to protect those crown jewels in the environment. But you need to be able to measure around how you respond to those incidents, and you really need the context of the OT asset owners to work hand in hand with you to coordinate a response. So it's really important to bring those OT stakeholders on every step of the journey. And OT cybersecurity is a journey. It's not a point-in-time project. It's a long-term journey with multiple different stakeholders in the organization, and it affects your organization's core business, which is why it's so important. So another question I get sometimes from people is, when it comes to OT SecOps and secure operations centers, should I have a separate OT SOC
or should I converge those functions into one environment? I can see philosophically the argument for both, but all things being equal, I tend to say to people, converged SOC is just a lot better. You got the overall organizational context of what's actually happening. You don't have two separate silos of data with an OT lens and an IT lens. And something like 50% of the OT breaches, this is from a SANS report a couple of years ago, something like half the OT breaches involve lateral movement from IT across to OT anyway. So you're going to be able to want to see the full picture, whether you detect it within IT first or within OT. And there was actually a really reasonably well documented attack. And this was actually using AI to write the attack code on a Mexican water utility where it laterally moved from IT across to OT. And it was purely the AI looking at this and going, oh, there's a path across here, and taking advantage of that lateral movement. So I think it's better to look at one set of event data. However, once you identify an event, the workflows, whether it's an IT or OT incident, are very different. And so I really advocate put all your effort into creating separate playbooks and workflows for OT incident response and tuning those with those OT stakeholders versus worrying about building a separate OT SOC with a separate SIEM and a separate data lake to look at. I think the same consideration is equally valid when you're looking at your digital forensics and incident response retainers. So, some are purely OT focused, some are solely focused on the IT world. And if you have a problem in OT, they're not going to be as helpful. Ideally, if you can work with a partner who can straddle both sets of use cases or have capabilities where you can address both IT and OT incident response and digital forensics, you're going to get a better outcome and you're going to be much better prepared to handle those incidents. So, you see this in the first video, OTCSJ, which stands for OT Cybersecurity Journey, because OT Cybersecurity is a journey, is a lightweight methodology. It's not a compliance standard, but it's a lightweight methodology I developed to make it really easy for organizations to build a simple plan if they don't have a dedicated OT cybersecurity specialist. And if you need an OT cybersecurity specialist, or if you tried to hire one, you'd know how difficult they are to identify and hire. And that's really where you can hire me on a fractional basis to help develop and build your program, not reinventing the wheel, because I've got all this intellectual property already. I can leverage that. And most of my work then becomes building the relationships with the stakeholders, particularly on the factory floor side of the environment, getting them bought in and cooperative on the program so that we can really deliver a good outcome. Now, threat detection really comes in that monitor and detect capability. And as you can probably guess, stage 3 is around asset discovery and visibility. You can't protect what you don't know about. And there's no point worrying about threat detection or incident response capability, or there's very little value if you don't have a good asset and network visibility to start with. So that's why I put that first. Then, before you sort of build that SOC capability, they kind of go hand in hand, but stage 4 is to really start to build out your, exposure remediation plans and at least do some basic IT-OT boundary segmentation. And then once you've got those things in place, you can start, get the stock stood up properly, send the logs in and start working there. I can see how someone might want to build the threat detection capability before they start looking at exposure management and network segmentation. But, I think you'll probably agree that you do need some level of asset and network visibility before you do either of those things. So building your IR playbooks, I personally prefer the SANS PICL framework. Very straightforward, simple to use. Lots of other people use it. The important thing is to have heavy involvement with OT stakeholders. You don't want them to build the framework for you, but what you can do is, build some simple workflows and workshop it with them and get them engaged, because one of the first things you're going to do in that, identification and containment stage of the workflow is get in touch with somebody who works at the plant who understands the business context, so that if you do need to initiate an emergency remediation, you can do your make safe procedures first, versus call them out of the blue. They never heard of you and saying, from cybersecurity, you're getting hacked, we need to shut the plant down. That's a much more chaotic way to approach responding to incidents. And they're going to be able to help you validate whether this is a true incident that you need to declare, or whether it's maybe a false positive or something that's not going to immediately cause safety or production harm to the facility. So you can also use these alerting capabilities in these tools like Clarity, for example, to alert on non-cyber incidents like mode changes and things like that. You know, that's really good for like the malicious insider use case, or if later on you need to investigate maybe a third party contractor did the wrong thing that they was weren't supposed to be doing when they logged into one of those systems. And the other really valuable thing is not about the workbooks you build day one, the workflows and playbooks. It's about how you learn from each execution of a playbook and tune your operational capability over time. And this is just another reason why it's so important to have good engagement from those OT stakeholders so that you're working together as a team to continually evolve your ability to respond to incidents. And that allows you to lower your mean time to detect and respond, which is a key measure for incident response capability, and also improve your alert catalog over time as you learn the network. You can start to tune alerts, maybe classify them by specific elements of the site systems that are the most critical, and you might set a higher alert threshold on those versus less critical systems, all those sorts of things. And it just becomes a virtuous cycle of improvement, versus the historical combative, both sides arguing because they think the other side doesn't get it. So here's an example playbook, again, using the Sans Pickle framework. So it's communication with malicious IP. So effectively, during the prep phase, and it sort of goes top to bottom, left to right. So you want to configure your alerts as well. So, I'm using Clarity Xtome here as the example. You want to configure that to alarm on the IPs and configure a SOC alert when the rule is triggered. Ideally your log alert threshold is set in such a way that kicks off an alert in your SIEM when it's triggered. You'll then assign that incident to a level 1 analyst to review, investigate that malicious comms, probably go back into Clarity to do that. They'll identify the affected site device and IP address and validate, okay, this is worth investigating. I'm now going to contact a site shift superintendent or a site tech operations person or someone to investigate what's actually happening. Then once you work with them to validate and agree the traffic is malicious, and you can validate the operational impact and work on how you terminate the connection. So that might involve launching make safe procedures prior to making those changes, identify and agree your proposed eradication method. So, you might block it at the firewall. You may also, at that point, if you've determined you've been breached, you may have mandatory breach obligations to notify either a regulator or, internal audit requirement. So you can complete those notifications. You then execute whatever that eradication method is, perhaps terminating that malicious connection, and then continue to monitor for a period afterwards to validate other attempts. And you might want to start to investigate, look at the firewall logs, look for other connections, either from that IP address or that same country location, just to see whether there's other attempts happening. Then you'll review the device configuration to ensure they're no longer impacted. You look for other similar kinds of suspicious activities, and then check your firewall, VPN, and remote access logs to see if there's been other similar activities there. And then you document the incident, lessons learned, and review and identify who it might have been, what the possible motive was, and then review whether you need to update or improve your border security controls. And that's a really good way to quickly and confidently identify and address an incident without impacting site safety or site operations. And the more orderly processes you run here with your OT site stakeholders, the more engaged you're going to be, and the more you're going to be able to work together as a team to get a great outcome. So let's talk a little bit about DFIR retainers, because I think they tend to be a very good thing to have on hand and trigger. I know a lot of these organizations that offer these services, you can call them out of the blue and say, hey, need help, and they'll go, yep, we'll sort out the purchase order later. Let's just get you some help. As I mentioned earlier, I think in this space, the ideal partners have both IT and OT capability because of that lateral movement is such a big part of a lot of OT cybersecurity incidents. And why I think it's good to buy a retainer ahead of time and provide access to your systems ahead of time, even if it's under a break glass type scenario, is that allows you to not lose time provisioning user access and getting them to help you. There's really not a huge amount to be lost. You can treat it like an insurance policy, but the plus side is a lot of the IR organizations will let you repurpose those hours at the end of the year if you haven't used them towards other proactive activities you can do, like tabletop exercises and security posture assessments. So, it's probably going to cost you a bit more than if you just hired a consulting organization to do that work, but it's a really good way to, number one, make use of, that insurance policy where, how often does your car insurer, offer you, give you back half of what you spent at the end of the year. But also it allows them to build a knowledge base of your environment and have more context if you do have an incident, need them to help you. I'll give you one example of an organization that does straddle IT and OT is Signia. Full disclosure, NetSeg has a contract with Signia to help support their OT DFIR activities in region, but they're a global organization with some extremely smart people. Signia.co is their website. And if you want an introduction with the Signia team, talk about how they work, just send me an email and I can set that up. That's no issue at all. So let's talk a little bit about threat hunting, which is more the proactive versus reactive approach. And, you really want to leverage your current asset visibility and baselines, which is another reason why it's good to have a good asset inventory. MITRE ATT&CK, if you didn't know, has a separate set of ICS mappings to investigate the specific attack methods through the cyber kill chain. And you can cross-reference that information with OT-specific threat intelligence. You want to prioritize probably the high-risk assets using threat hunts, and this is a great thing to start to bring the OT stakeholders in the tent for. Go, hey, we're going to look for persistent hackers. Vault Typhoon is a great example in this next point about people using those specific living off the land techniques. Being able to know the environment, know what those sort of activities might look like aberrations, abnormal activity, unusual commands being sent. And really, the cleaner your baseline, the cleaner your ability to hunt for those threat actors. And so if you do have, and you must have, a close relationship with those OT stakeholders, they're going to be very helpful helping you validate those suspicious processes and communications happening in the environment and work together to protect your industrial systems. So we'll jump to the Clarity demo now. I'm going to take you through a few things. I'm going to show you Threat Center, World Map. These are Clarity things, but other vendors have similar capabilities. Some network signatures. I'll show you how alerts and alert configuration works, just from some examples of how you might configure those during the prep phase of your workflows. And then some MITRE ATT&CK mapping and threat hunting. So we'll pivot over to Clarity X-Dome. I've got the alerts overview dashboard here. So this is the kind of dashboard you might want to build for your SOC analysts who are doing OT workflows. Might help coordinate their threat hunting activities or help them just keep on top of what's happening in the environment. We're going to use the alerts and threat tabs. So the first thing we're going to do is go to the threat center. And this is where really I have a real interest where it comes to threat intelligence of understanding, well, okay, it's good to know all the different threat actors that are out there, but what exploits that they're using are the ones that are affecting my organization. So the more business context I can have, the more valuable that is for your organization to protect it. And so what's good is there's a whole bunch of threat intelligence here from different organizations. But, I like to go straight to the relevant tab and look at what is relevant. And this is a good one to look at. This is the one I mentioned earlier, the AI-driven breach of Mexican government infrastructure, right? This was only came out 13th of May. So that's 2 weeks ago. And we can see here with 3 vulnerabilities and 3 malicious IPs. So if we just click into that, well, that's the report there. Just go back. Here we go. So there are 3 related vulnerabilities and 10 malicious IPs, and these are the devices affected by those vulnerabilities. So we might want to maybe look at these devices affected by this particular vulnerability. They're all domain servers, right? So this can really help us. You're not going to probably patch a lot of IoT devices. You're probably not going to patch 864 devices in one go. But if we can look at, just focus on the critical risk scores as a starting point, that filters us down to 277, a little bit more manageable. Look, Toshiba point of sale, Windows 10 IoT, it's an exposed device with a KEV vulnerability. Right. If we've got a remediation for these devices, let's just pick the one at the top. We can look at the risk simulator. Well, how much can we reduce this risk? We can drop it down to 28 by patching it. So let's do that as a starting point. And, the IoT point of sales devices, let's push that patch out at the end of the day. There's less risk there. Maybe do it on a test machine first, and we'll be good to go. So the next thing we're going to look at is World Map, and that is under the Network tab, actually. Now, it wouldn't be a vendor SaaS portal without having a map of the world with IP addresses and color codes and things like that. Me being slightly facetious there. But what we want to look at is malicious connections, So, and if you're operating in certain countries, you might want to also look at, certain countries where, or if you're tracking a threat actor, maybe look at those countries. But we're seeing malicious connections here from Canada, Singapore, and Colombia. And these are the communicating devices. So we might want to just focus on the OT devices, right? Because they're the ones that we have the most interest in. Let's go have a look at all these devices, who might be attacking them, and which ones we can try and remediate this risk for. There's a few criticals here. This building management system by Vasala, engineering workstation by Emerson, HMIs here. Well, we might want to address these. So again, we can have a look in here and have a look at the vulnerabilities and how we might remediate those things. And look, with the data collection method, that was found by a mix of passive collection and edge scanning, which is Clarity's safe active scanning mechanism. You can also even see where the location is and what it's connecting to. So we can see here, this HMI is connected to a lot of infrastructure and it's connecting to some internet IPs as well as malicious IPs. So first, we want to kill those connections off. We probably don't want direct connectivity out to the internet. We want to probably go through an ITOT DMZ layer. So this is a great opportunity to address this incident, but also remediate it so that it's not going to happen again. This particular incident isn't going to happen again. So now let's look at some alerts, right? So, you don't want to overwhelm yourself with alerts, but if we look at, these are the different alerts we're seeing in the system, and you want to shunt those over to a SIEM and maybe give each, if you use RBAC to give each plant operator visibility of their own site, they're going to be able to help you. They're going to log in and help you coordinate how you do the alerts. But in alert configurations, we can start to build, there's standard alerts here. We can start to build custom alerts as well. And, this is one I built earlier called ISC high risk device. So it's effectively looking for, I'll edit it just to show you. So I just built this rule from scratch, pretty straightforward. ISC high risk device. We want the risk score of the device to be critical. And we want the alerts to be, any indicator of a compromise. So malicious communication, infected device, suspicious behavior, weak password. Other exposures like vulnerabilities, that's separate. We'll do that under the exposure and vulnerability section video. I'll do that as a separate video, but that you can set that rule up, apply it, and then you can see that there's one alert with 4 affected devices. So we can go into here and click on it here, and we can see the affected devices that we want to address. And so, that laptop, we can probably address that straight away. And then these building automation systems, we just want to maybe talk to the facilities team first and see if there's any impact if we go and address those issues. But it looks like we've got exposed devices with CABs, with malicious communication. So we want to patch those pretty much straight away. Now, go back to when you've got, if we look at the overall exposures, vulnerability, let's just quickly go back to vulnerabilities overview to look at, there are 77,000 device vulnerability pairs and 3,900 total vulnerabilities. You compare that to drilling it down to 4 related to critical risk and having an indicator of compromise. This is a much more manageable number to take to the plant location and address versus chucking, 5,000 vulnerabilities over the fence and saying, I need you to fix these because they're your problem now. You're never going to get anywhere with that approach. So this is why it's really good to filter down and focus on those things that are highest risk. The final thing I'll show you is just a bit of threat hunting using MITRE ATT&CK. So the good thing here is Clarity, it's got MITRE ATT&CK Enterprise as well. But we'll focus on MITRE ATT&CK ICS because that's what we're most interested in. And you can see the different attack techniques through the cyber kill chain here. So we'll just look at exploiting a public-facing application alert. So you see there's 12 alerts associated. Let's just go to the 12 alerts here. This threat alert, network threat signature, right? So we're seeing this threat signature here that we want to look at, drive-by compromise. All right, let's click into that. And so we can see it's been unresolved. We can see who's been assigned to it. You can add notes if you need. Here's some threat signature information about it. Very high confidence. And these are the two affected devices, both in Houston. So if we know the plant operator at Houston, we can give them a call and say, hey, this is what we're investigating. Can you let us know if you're seeing anything funny happening? Maybe log into the HMI or the SCADA system and just see what's happening. But let's look at line 2. It's ABB Engineering Workstation. Here's all the information about it, where it is, MAC address, things like that. Again, this was identified by both passive collection and edge scan. This is the risk, but let's go down. We're trying to work out how we respond to an incident. That's the alert that we were triggered when we went through the minor attack mapping, and we can see where it's communicating with. So what we can do is, we're not just saying it's this machine, but talk to the engineer and say, look, these are the machines that we're seeing it connect to. Can we quickly re-image this or take it offline or invoke a backup procedure, like a make safe procedure, SCADA service connected to? We can quickly see what that immediate blast radius might look like if someone has indeed compromised this machine and then are using it to laterally move, or maybe change the control settings on these devices at level 1 or the Purdue layer. You can see it's a pretty heavily used device. It's 88% activity rate, and it's used 21 hours a day. So it's a pretty heavily used machine, but maybe we can get that quick window late at night to do an emergency update and address that. And maybe that's how you respond to that incident. The beauty is when you're working hand in hand with those OT counterparts, you can very quickly manage and respond to that incident and use the learnings from that to improve your ability to respond to future incidents. So that's really all I had to share for the demo. Conclusion, threat detection is a great thing to do, but there's some steps you need to do first. That foundational network and asset visibility is required to build the detection capability. Something I didn't mention in the video yet, but this is really where you have the value of doing network spans, is to do threat detection, identify things like malicious comms. So maybe you do your asset visibility first and focus on exposure management, and over the next couple of months, as you configure the spans and put the network sensors in, you can start to build your threat detection capability. The reality is it's the simple things that get targeted first. There's a lot of simple stuff out there that's surprised it hasn't been targeted sooner by more attackers. Converging your IT and OT SOC function makes more sense to give you the overall enterprise view of what's happening. But you just need to be conscious that the IR playbooks are very different for OT than they are for the IT world. And again, if you need help developing your IR playbooks, I have intellectual property around that I can help you use with templates and things like that to build. But they need to be co-created with the stakeholders. So they're not going to be fully tuned and ready to go, because they're going to be like 80% of what you need based on my understanding of your organization, your environment. But then you sit down with those OT stakeholders, like a plant superintendent, automation engineer, someone like that, and go, hey, here's how we want to respond to a cyber attack. Let's think about what you want to do. How do we coordinate these activities so that when something does happen, and this is a great scenario, by the way, to run a tabletop exercise, so for future video, starting to model these scenarios and getting as prepared as you can so that when you do respond to the incident, you're more orderly, but you're much more ahead of the curve to learn a lot more from that experience versus it being absolute chaos and only then going, oh, we need to do something about this. It doesn't take a long time. A few conversations or workshops can really get you much more ready than you might have been earlier. And finally, when it comes to threat hunting, the better you understand the assets, and again, you need the context from the plant engineers to understand the asset criticality and the asset purpose and where those critical crown jewels are in the overall system within a plant facility, the better you're going to be able to identify deviations from those baseline behaviors. So with that, my name is Leon Poggioli. If you want to talk more about this, happy to have a, free chat, give you a couple of quick pointers at no cost. Leon at NetSegIO, and that's my phone number. And then if it makes sense to use me as a fractional specialist or use some of my intellectual property to build out your own program, that's what I'm built to do. So give me a call. Love to talk further, and have a great day.